We're going to continue our theme of celebrating the Great Lakes, the importance of the Great Lakes from a cultural, environmental, and economic perspective. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Brian Tucker, who will help us celebrate the cultural importance of the lakes. Dr. Tucker is an ecologist with strong links to the traditional Métis way of life, as well as to commercial fishing, logging, and trapping industries. Brian's the Associate Director of Education and Way of Life for the Metis Nation of Ontario. In that capacity, Brian travels across much of Ontario, working closely with Métis communities, industry representatives in the resource and energy sectors, and government officials. Welcome, Brian.
Well, thanks, Mike, for that introduction, and hello to everyone. Thank you for giving me a little bit of time in your very, very busy agenda to talk a little bit about, I guess, a Métis perspective on celebrating the Great Lakes and water, I should say, as well. And certainly, because as Métis people, for us, all things are connected. I have a fair bit of latitude in what I can talk about, but I'm going to try and narrow it down and keep it to water as much as possible. But I think over the next 15 minutes or so, you'll see that there are many interconnections for Métis people who use the lands and the waters in the Great Lakes Basin. Okay. So I think it's important, just ever so briefly, to provide some context to briefly introduce the Métis people. And the Métis are a distinct Aboriginal people with a unique history, culture, language, and territory. That territory includes the waterways in Ontario. It surrounds the Great Lakes. It spans out to what is known as the historic Northwest. Thank you, Carla. And there's a very important historical connection for the Métis people when it comes to the Great Lakes. The Métis people in Ontario have historic rights-bearing communities throughout much of the basin of the Great Lakes and communities throughout the Canadian side. And the Great Lakes and their surrounding waterways were very important during the fur trade, as you know. They were the main transportation routes during that period of time. And it was along those locations on these fur trade routes that Métis communities formed historically, and they still exist today. So the historic significance for us is very great because it was here in these locations in the Great Lakes Basin and in some other locations in Ontario as well that the Métis Nation and the Métis people were actually born and came into being. And that connection to the water and the land continues today. It's not just a historical thing. It's very much contemporary, as you'll see in the next couple slides. And it continues through our traditional Métis way of life. And the Métis way of life is very much multidimensional. It's quite literally a way of living. It's the way that a person, a Métis community, interacts with the environment and is part of it. The way of life involves a reliance on the environment for food, for spiritual fulfillment, ceremonial purposes, medicine, livelihood. And the way of life includes having knowledge about edible and medicinal plants, harvesting techniques, traditions, the environment, water, music, dance, and language. Water is very important to the Métis people. It nourishes us, it sustains us, it supports the ecosystem that in turn sustains us as a people and our traditional way of life. As I mentioned, we have communities in many parts of the Great Lakes Basin. And those communities continue today to rely on the Great Lakes for, again, spiritual fulfillment, for food, for our families and our communities. The passing of our traditional knowledge from one generation to the next, I'll talk about that a little bit more, and income as well. And so we have historically and today still commercial fishers on the lakes. And there's also very much a spiritual connection to water. The Métis people are part of the land and the water ecosystem, and we look to those lands and waters for our spiritual fulfillment. So I want to talk just a little bit about those connections. You can see we start our fishers off as very small. So the Great Lakes have always provided both food and income for our people. And these pictures are from not quite 40 years ago. So the previous presenters there had a picture of the Great Lakes 1972 signing. These pictures are just a little bit younger than those. But you'll also see for the next couple slides a whole series of pictures that are only 1 year or within a year old. And it's to provide context and to explain that very much the Métis way of life in our communities are very vibrant and alive today. And there's a couple things in these pictures just to note. The wooden boxes on the left have certainly a commercial catch from the time, from a Métis commercial fishery, but there's also some fish species in there that were going to go be used as food for the family as well. And so although when we write things down on paper, it's very easy to compartmentalize, break things down, categorize activities on the landscape and how a person interacts with the land. When you actually practice them, oftentimes there's a blending of those activities. And on the right, that little fellow there, he's actually collecting suckerheads from that pile. That's a commercial fishery picture, but he's collecting suckerheads to eat, actually, to make suckerhead soup. So there's a very strong connection and a respect for the waters that sustain us and our future generations. And that very much continues today. So these are contemporary pictures all across our communities. You can go to any of our communities inside the basin and outside the basin across Ontario. And you'll see our traditional knowledge holders teaching our children the Métis way of life. They do that by taking them out onto the land, onto the water, teaching them how to harvest, telling them stories, teaching them their language, Michif, teaching them how to dance and play music, teaching them how to cook that food later on after it's harvested. And the water is an essential element, part of the environmental matrix, if you will, on which we practice our traditional ways. And kind of woven through those experiences is the transfer of that traditional knowledge from one generation to the next. So if you think of it as our memories and our practices and our skills are actually our library, which is alive all the time, but needs to be passed on. This is an example of that. I'll just talk about one picture there on the left. That's a picture of 3 generations of people using a gill net to harvest some fish, in this case. But you could apply it to fishing with a hook and line to gather fish, or fishing in other ways, or harvesting plants, for example. And the lady in the center of that picture is the grandmother. The fellow on the far left is her son. And the small little fellow there is the lady's grandson. And the person to the left is his uncle. So you kind of have a mixture of the family there together, but 3 generations of people. Certainly both people, the son and the grandson, are learning from the grandmother as they practice their activity. The young fellow is learning from his uncle as well. And it's a very fluid thing. And so it's not, this is part of an activity that's carried out, and the teaching is done as that, in this case, the fish is being harvested. There's also 3 generations on the other picture as well. And so certainly there's that strong reliance on water, Great Lakes, for food for our communities. Many of our communities, especially in the Great Lakes, have a very strong history, very strong histories in commercial fisheries. That tradition is carried out today by a small number of our commercial fishers, and that's especially true in the Great Lakes. This is an example, again, around 40 years ago, of lifting a gill net through the ice. And you can find similar pictures in the photo albums of our people throughout our communities. Although, unfortunately, we've lost many of those fisheries over the years, in some cases due to past government actions, the waters still provide income for some of our fishers today. But we haven't forgot that very important part of our history, of our traditions, and of that connection to water, to the lakes and the rivers and the Great Lakes. Water is also important for travel for us. Where there is a lot of water, and the Great Lakes are a perfect example of that, in the sense of our communities being situated along the northern shorelines of those lakes. Our people often use it for travel for harvesting. They'll travel to harvest large game by boat, for example. This is an example of a community hunt where the site was accessed by boat. But it could be blueberry picking as well. And again, I want to stress the vibrancy and the contemporary nature of that way of life today. In all of our communities, these types of things are happening, that connection to the land, and especially the water is there. Water is connected to everything in the ecosystem, and we're part of that. And so these are just some examples from the last few years. And the far upper left is a deer harvest, and then the far upper right, sorry, is a deer harvest. The far lower left, although it's difficult to see it in the orange there is actually a 4-year-old, and amongst all that orange, helping to skin that deer. And then on the lower right was the next day where, part of that, it's not just the taking of the animal that becomes important, for example, but also what you do with that after, the teachings around that, and then how it's used. And so that was kind of cooking the stew from that animal the next day. There's also a long history of trapping in our communities. Many of our families either have current or past connections with trapping. And just by its nature, trapping involves a very close relationship to water. You use it for travel. Well, oftentimes you'll be staying out on the land potentially, and many of the animals that you're connecting with, are around bodies of water. And so on your left is traveling in the springtime, trapping, and on the right is traveling in the fall by boat. And here are more examples of traveling at different times of the year on water to access various harvesting sites, family gathering sites, trapping sites, commercial fishing sites, and to practice the Métis way of life. And it happens throughout the year, and these are great pictures because on the far left, that's traveling late in the spring. So for any of the ice travelers out there in the crowd, you may recognize that ice is kind of looking like leather or the scale of a lizard, and that's because that ice is honeycomb now. It's about to, relatively shortly, within a week or so or a few weeks, start to get quite unstable, and so the ice is actually long needles, and all the snow and the water that is laying on that ice as it melted in the springtime has flown directly through that ice now. So that's called honeycomb ice. It's traveling late in the spring. And then the far right-hand side is traveling late in the fall, and you can see the path where the boat has broken a channel through that ice in order to get to a harvesting site and back out. And you can tell by the person all bundled up in the snowsuit there that it's quite cold out. So this lake, is currently in the process, or this waterway here, and part of the lake is in the process of freezing every night, opening a little bit in the daytime. So it's right before freeze up. And again, it's a response to and the use of the environment and the dependence on the environment and the water that binds it all together. That's key. And again, very much alive today. It's through this practice of the way of life, the dependence on the land and the water, that we honor the waters that sustain us. The Métis people are part of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem. We very much see ourselves as a part of and integrated with the ecosystem. We don't see ourselves as an external thing or entity, if you will. And so for us, celebrating and honoring the Great Lakes, and indeed all water, and the ecosystems around us that's supported by that water, stems from the importance that we place on our future generations. So our waters and their ecosystems support and nurture our families and our communities. But the Great Lakes nurtures and supports all of us, and all of our families and all our communities. I think we need to keep that in mind. Certainly for our Métis communities, the waters allow us to practice our traditional way of life, and through that practice, pass our knowledge and our traditions on to our children and grandchildren. And if we all continue to honor and protect them, they will continue to do that far into the future. So with that, I'll close with that thought. I know I'm standing between you and your break, but before I do go, I'd just like to say that Métis artists Alicia Bloor and Joanna Burt are going to be providing some Métis music and dance in room 205B, so feel free to swing by and check that out as well. Again, thank you very much for your time.